Hi everyone. Welcome to this concurrent session. My name is Shrika Velevela and I'll be chairing this session today. Apologies for the technical difficulties. We've got two speakers who are meant to be joining virtually, but we're not quite able to connect to Zoom at the moment. And as such, the slides won't be presented either. So please just bear with us as Tal will be just talking through the content while the staff here try to work out the technical difficulties. So today we have presenters from Deloitte Consulting discussing the multifaceted and topical issue of climate change and the risk in managing to net zero in financial services. Just a quick introduction about the speakers. So Raymond Bennett is a principal in Deloitte Consulting, actuarial and insurance solutions with 25 years of experience both internationally and in Australia. Ray is focused on financial reporting and risk management and has worked in all practice areas across a wide range of projects, including financial transformations, actuarial modeling, capital management, and mergers and acquisition. Tal is a partner leading the business algorithms team at Deloitte Consulting. He has over 20 years of experience working with large global financial organizations, advising clients in Australia and Asia Pacific on quantitative modeling, risk management, capital modeling and stress testing, and quantitative strategy. And lastly, we have Michelle, who's a senior manager at Deloitte Consulting and is a current member of the Actuaries Institute Climate Risk Working Group. Before we begin, please send your questions through the Summit app or use the QR code on your name tag. And also use the Summit app to provide feedback on the session at the end. All right, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Tal and the presenters.
Thank you so much. First of all, apologies for the inconvenience. I think I'm just going to talk. You're not going to be able to see the slides, which is a little bit unorthodox. It's not going to be much of a problem for me, but I think it's going to be a bit of a problem for you guys. And, we were meant to be splitting the presentation into three parts. We'll see what we could do. Potentially we're going to be circulating that. I promise this is not a trick from Deloitte. Just protecting the integrity of our clients. It's just just some technical difficulties. Good. Well, first of all, I'm actually really glad to present here today after, 2 years of COVID and being able to be face to face with clearly, I was just saying, talking the other day about the challenges between going back to normal. This is clearly one of them where we are combining the physical world with virtual. We're going to be talking about a really important topic today, which is climate risk. I think, the agenda was actually pre-packed, with a lot of presentations, so we were going to have to skipping the slides and so on. I tried to do my best, with my part, and hopefully we're going to be able to resolve before I finish. So, why is it important, climate risk? So I think a number of us in this forum, we had to explain to execs that question years ago. But I'm hoping that now, everyone knows that we do have to play a role primarily as actuaries to grant a bright future for humanity, right? A number of things to mention. So first of all, increasing impact of risk, right? So by now, we probably all know that climate risks impact physical assets, right, and the economy. So when we're talking about physical asset, we need to understand that in the broader sense of the term. So first of all, financial assets and the financial implications, but we also need to consider the natural capital value of assets as well, right? When we're talking about the economy, this is going to be essentially changing the structure of the economy. We've already seen that, changing sectors, what sectors will survive, what companies will survive, how they can react and adapt, right? And we see it already, right? We see it live, with the perils, with floods, bushfires and cyclones, and how is that changing, both, the physical assets themselves and essentially the economy as well. I think one of the important aspects of climate risk is that the high complexity and the variability makes us sometimes confuse trends and randomness. We'll see that, but we have several cycles and how to subtract that is actually quite difficult. We'll go into the details of climate modeling in a bit. The other point is that it extends to all sectors of the economy, right? So as I mentioned before, they're already triggering some changes in the structure. If you think about a company like Tesla, right, and the vision that they had, and how much it's worth now compared to 5 and even several years ago, we can see that changing coming up. It's not only about the asset itself; it's also about the preference of the customers and what they want and what they actually thrive for. It's also applicable to the employees as well, right? We typically, as actuaries, we are used to extrapolate from past history, right? So we look at past history, we look at the trend, and statistically we try to project into the future. That's not possible. We'll see that in a sec, but that's not possible with climate risk. It's highly nonlinear, right? And there are a set of thresholds that once they are touched, right, it's really hard to get out of them or reverse the effects. Human activities have been causing climate change, increasing frequency, severity of extreme climate events, heat waves, heavy rainfall, droughts. We can see that. This is somewhat controversial, hopefully not so much for this group, but there is clear scientific evidence that human activity has got great influence over climate change, and this continues to be the case, essentially. When we look at the government entities at their role, right, I can say that they're just now starting to pay attention about this, seriously incorporating that into the planning. We can now see the news. I actually woke up this morning, with really news on the subjects about the insurability, for the future. But there is a really key role from the government in terms of granting that insurability when you're talking about planning. We had a number of conversations with different agencies, and they're now starting to incorporate the effects of climate risk into the planning. 2 questions for you as a group. One, is it late, right? Is it enough? What's happening right now? The other point why it's important is the effects of climate change will increase with further warming. The sobering reality is that, it's already in motion, right? So, what we are experiencing now, we already done it, right? It has a huge lag due to the carbon cycles of the climate systems. And a lot of what we are experiencing now has been dictated in the past. So we are under a moral hazard problem, which is very well known for actuaries. And I think the role of actuaries is key. Why is that? Because we as actuaries, we can look at the future, bring back to present value, and incorporate those effects, financial effects, directly into the decision maker. If we don't do it, they're not going to see it. And if it doesn't hit the balance sheet, they're not going to respond to it. It's as simple as that, right? So we do have a very important role to play. Some changes are irreversible. This is, again, sobering. Some of the changes could be slow. Some of the changes could be stopped in limiting the future warming that is going to happen. I came across a way of thinking that, okay, cool, so we are live now. I came across lately a bit of a thinking that, we could fix it later, right? A lot of people, I think there's a good movie around this, essentially Masks, but Don't Look Up, where, there is that sort of sense that we could potentially fix it later. And, unfortunately, some of the changes will be irreversible just by facts, or, just technically reversible, which means that it's going to take several centuries to be reversed. Right, then we go into more detail in a bit. What's going on, Well, a lot's going on, but I feel that this is a little bit of a post-mortem analysis to me, because everything, as I said before, has been dictated, right? So, first of all, global temperatures are warming at a rate that is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. So, this is sometimes really hard to see. We need to, again, our role as actuaries is very important, because we need to essentially detangle what are the natural warming and cooling cycles from Earth, right, from what is a trend, and we need to remove the multi-year seasonality type of variation, right. There's a really nice a clock type animation that shows, like, the differences against the averages and how essentially they are increasing. So we need to look not only at the point in time average temperature, but we need to look at the changes against the averages, right, and how they are changing as a trend going forward. Extreme climate events are happening, heat waves, including marine heat waves that, like, rarely get into the news, but actually quite relevant. Heavy rainfall, droughts. As actuaries, I think we're a little bit tired of hearing this is the worst event in 100 years, every 2 years, right? So there's a clear reason for that, right? And I see that, I saw that, like, in the news and with the government disclosures as well. There is a clear shift in the probability distribution, right? And that changes. And obviously, what is perceived as an outlier, it's truly not, right? So when we look at the outliers and the events and so on, we need to look at what years we're actually projecting. We're experiencing compound extreme events, concurrent heat waves, droughts, storm surge. Well, the nature of climate risks, it involves multiple events triggered by shifts in climate systems, right? One example of that is La Nina. It was meant to be like one in 10 years event, and now, like, we have that consecutively in the last 2 years. You just like do the math about, like, how really this is shifting or not. It makes it very difficult to extrapolate, right? Because it's a really complicated system of correlated risks, right? And again, it's highly nonlinear, so it's really hard to extrapolate. And we can all relate to recent events like, floods, bushfires, and so on. It's important to highlight the impacts to forests and reefs that, when we're talking about irreversibility, right? So just recently, I don't know if you guys know, but there was a major bleaching event in the Great Barrier Reef, like, due to essentially to all the rain. The rain, the currents, and a few other things as well. And the truth is that we don't know how much it suffered and how long it will take to recover, if it can be recovered even, right? And this is actually pretty recent. The last thing, what's going on? Well, climate change has been formally attributed, scientifically attributed, essentially there's clear evidence that pre-industrial period has been a consequence of human activities. Won't go into much detail there. I think there is a laundry list of things that we've done wrong in the past and we should correct. But I think, and again, a role of actuaries is actually very important. Key is prioritization, right? So fixing climate change is very expensive. And there are other considerations and secondary order effects as well. So we need to understand what are the things that we could do in the short term that are going to be generating a greater impacts. Right, and in terms of the secondary hazards, wars and political stability is something we need to pay a lot of attention to. A more inclusive world will achieve essentially greater outcomes in the future. If you think about the Maslow pyramid, when you're trying to explain someone suffering, threats in terms of personal safety, what's going to be, relevant for 30 years, I think you're going to have a bit of a problem. Good. So I'm just going to give a bit of a brief introduction to climate modeling and how it works. I mean, 3 things I wanted to mention there. Complexity, I already mentioned that. Dynamic development, like, it changes all the time. Feedback loops, these are the thresholds that once you hit, like, they're really hard to come out from. So we start with the climate change scenarios. Essentially, the projections around temperature. I'll stop there. Then we have the climate systems and integrations. This is probably the part that is the least understood. And the most important one, and what imposes primarily high non-linearity, so the carbon cycles, the energy cycles, and the hydro cycles. Then we go into the financial projections of future scenarios. That is a little bit industry specific. So, essentially we need to make sure that we kind of back solve to the climate systems that we need in order to project the products that we have in each particular industry. If we're talking about banking, for example, and mortgages, 30 years. If we're talking about life insurance, or long-term liability policies, right? So we need to essentially, it's going to have a different way of projecting financial scenarios. And more importantly, it's like when we're talking about a 1 in 100-year event, right? Or we're talking about the tail, we need to talk about what 100-year events you're talking about, right? So essentially, it's not the same 1 in 100 years now than 1 in 100 years in 10 years. And because it's of the dynamic nature, we need to adjust that, as we go. It's important to overlay, the financial and engineering aspects as well. Like, we know that, as actuaries, that, it's not only about the risk, it's also about the contract and how the contract has been written, right? And, how that affects, how the risk affects the contract itself. There's another layer of complexity here, like probably those who work in GI are a bit more familiar with this, but if you have a particular property or particular asset that has, it's not only about the assets and the infrastructure as well, and they have certain engineering aspects, right? It might not be the same effects to the house next door, right? So that makes it actually pretty difficult to preempt. There are a lot of considerations and variables. And then finally, we do need to model transition risk. Right, I feel that that's a little bit more relevant for banking, given that you actually finance corporates and other firms, for the long term. But it's equally important, primarily, not so much in Australia, but I think in the US they're paying a lot of attention, in terms of life insurance and how that the economy, the changes in the economy essentially is going to be affecting the economic context. So for the economic side of things, we do need to project the scenarios, economic scenarios, unfortunately, and then extrapolate from that, what potentially could be the effects. I'll go quickly to the role of actuary in the modelling. I'm going to be pretty brief, but essentially what constitutes climate change scenarios, I think we primarily rely on other climate experts rather than just getting actively involved. These are reports that you use globally by everyone. When you're talking about the climate system and integrations, we still rely largely on other experts, but because the reports and the variety of the reports is so broad, and it could be, it's essentially, there's no really one global climate system. There are regional climate systems, and we need to look at them and how they impact your particular portfolio. And there usually are several options for that. So I think we do need to understand that and how that relates to the financial projections. Obviously, if you're talking about the financial projections, and you need to understand the products and what is required, what is the other key risk variables that we need to project, and then obviously, very traditional for us, overlaying the financial contracts. Now, on the engineering aspects, we do need to rely again and on third parties and probably understand that in depth and how that can potentially affect. And for transition risk impacts, we typically don't model ourselves the economy, but again, we need to understand the outputs of that. I think with that said, can we can they speak? The other presenters? Okay, cool. Excellent. So then I'm going to be very brief. There is a key thing around implementing climate risk modelling. You need to understand your business. That's key, right? Climate risk is very complex, so you need to be pretty nimble in terms of what you're going to be implementing. Two things I want to say. So one is communication is key. Communication with stakeholders. In my own experience, that's actually been very difficult. How to translate that complexity into, actionable points, primarily in the short term and considering all the moral hazard that I mentioned before. And the other one is pragmatism, right? So we can't really model everything. If you think we can, we cannot, right? So everything that I mentioned before, it requires a lot of simulation, a lot of scenarios to be meaningful given the shifts in the probability distributions. So we need to be pragmatic and just focus on what will have most impact. Well, with that said, I think, Michelle, if you can now speak, I'm going to be handing that over to you.
Hey, Tal. Thanks for that. Are you able to hear me? Is that coming through okay?
Yep, perfect.
Awesome, great. So I'll skip through a few of these slides because I'll cover them in a bit more detail later as we go through specific examples. I'd like to start off with kind of introducing the regulatory landscape as well. So having gone through the discussion on types of climate risks, complexities, as Tal mentioned, in understanding and modeling these climate risks and implications, it's not that surprising that there have been developments in the regulatory guidance around the world relating to climate change. So I won't go through this and read every example to you, but what I did want to call out is in Australia, APRA's released guidance on managing and disclosing financial risks of climate change through CPG 229. And similarly, ASIC expects companies to have appropriate governance structures to manage climate risks. I'll skip over the rest of the detail of this slide, but it's around, I guess, taking ownership of that new risk and embedding it, more importantly, embedding it into the risk management framework that exists. So given that climate risk is evolving quite quickly, it's complex, full of uncertainties, one of the more common ways to understand and therefore manage and disclose climate risk is through scenario analysis, which is what I'll introduce briefly now. Scenario analysis at its most basic, if we think about fundamental principles, we want to specify emission trajectories, temperature rises, transition and physical risk impacts, and then for each of these scenarios, apply them to the exposures of the company and compare results. So you can see here on the left-hand side here, we have this table which goes through your baseline, which is essentially your current or best estimate case, and then varying levels of mitigation. The graphs on the right-hand side kind of give a bit more flavor into the inputs of these scenarios. So at the top here on the upper right, we have scenarios relating to energy composition under two policy scenarios, one a bit more aggressive than the other. And then the chart at the bottom here, it actually corresponds to the colors that we're showing on the left as well. But it kind of gives an example of surface temperature changes under each of those scenarios. And of course, this can then be used as further inputs into climate modeling or understanding different risks and how they interact with each other. So that sounds kind of simple, no? But it's actually not that straightforward. It's even identifying your risk exposure areas is complex and challenging. It requires quite thorough and holistic understanding of the business and the industry that the business operates in. So some other complexities in addition to that include defining the climate risk narrative as an overview and then considering short and long-term implications separately. So I'll go through the different stages now to kind of managing risks and detailed considerations of each stage. And I'll step through some examples as we talk through this, so we get a bit more of an understanding of challenges and considerations as we're building up this framework. So the first stage here is around determining the key risks and opportunities, focusing on knowing and understanding the business and exposures, as I mentioned earlier. So one method to achieve this is through firstly starting with a heat map, identifying, brainstorming key risks and opportunities relating to the sectors or the parts of the business in scope that you want to understand. The heat map will then be underpinned by the opportunities and the key risks across the entire business. So essentially we're using this diagram here as a starting point for discussion and for conversations. But having had this, it's important to then test it with relevant stakeholders. And this is important in making sure that each part of the business can contribute into identifying the risks that need to be explored. So once you have agreed, for example, here we've circled, these risks here are the important ones that we want to be focusing on. We then generate risk statements for each of them. And a good way to do this would be through workshops, prioritizing risks and creating each risk statement to frame your key problems, defining the scope, and then considering what disclosures are required as well. So for example, if the aim is to produce something that's can be used for TCFD disclosures, that would be part of that risk statement as well. So having all of the kind of components there, the next step is to identify the drivers of each risk statement. So the underlying climate and transition variables. Existing knowledge of the environment would be useful at this step to feed in. However, knowing that, not a lot of companies have specialized research in these areas, it's important to kind of enable exploration through other scenarios or other avenues to supplement the drivers and identifying the drivers. And then the last stage here is to identify the available data and then map certain locations. So here's an example that we have using a lending and insurance case to show the interlinkages between the identified climate risks and the exposures of the portfolio. So on the left, we start with insurance exposures and lending exposures in this particular example, which are overlaid with then scenario choices on your physical risk and your transition risks. These then feed into consequences. So for example, damages from perils, loan serviceability, unemployment, things like that. And then feeds into kind of consequences and ramifications. So starting with this holistic view in stage one, you can see quite clearly helps to identify key considerations for risk management and quantification. As I mentioned earlier, some of the important factors to consider are data availability and the requirements, priority and prevalence of the perils that you're considering, factoring in future exposures, level of detail that's required, and then very importantly, what decisions are your analysis going to drive and how will your results integrate into existing processes? So once these key questions have been addressed, then we're ready for the next stage. And the next stage is to develop the assessment framework. So just in the interest of time, I know we have quite a bit of content to cover. I'll jump through the key main topics of this stage, and then we'll flow on to Q&A, hopefully, if there is time after Ray's part. So the key components of this stage are to leverage the existing risk registers. So that comes back to my point earlier that managing climate risk shouldn't be something that's independent from the existing risk management framework. And having an understanding of what is there, the frameworks and procedures will help guide the decisions around scenarios and timescales, and will ultimately contribute to constructing the heat map over here on the right. So what we have here is something that you want to be achieving around this stage, which is mapping out each of your key risks based on the statements that we developed in stage one, and the vulnerability and impact of each risk statement. This framework here, because of how quickly climate risk is changing, needs to be quantitative and qualitative. And having those two components will help inform the color or the rating of the heat map. The other thing I wanted to touch on before we jump to the next stage is this timeline at the bottom. So it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but ultimately this is a nice visual way to represent along the horizontal axis is time, and then vertically we have the composition of different risks as different colors, and this is what we're looking to manage as part of the framework. So over time you want to be scaling down in some areas, accepting others and things like that. Okay, is that all good so far? Haven't lost anyone? So moving on to the third step, and having understood the business risk exposures, the key risk statements, we can then start to perform the actual impact and likelihood assessments for each risk statement based on physical and transition risk scenarios. I'd like to reiterate here, it seems like, maybe we have a desire to get to this step as fast as possible because we just want to see what the impact is. We want to know what the numbers are, but really, it's really important to kind of think through each of the stages as each of them build on one another, and it helps shape and direct the assessment and the analysis, knowing that obviously time is scarce and resources are scarce. So it's important to get stages 1 and 2 kind of right and agreed before we jump into things like analysis and assessments. The key steps of this stage is firstly to obtain scenario projections for each risk statement. So depending on the risk statement and the timescales, ideally you want to be considering geographic modeling and layering on different types of risks. So an example I have here on the right-hand side is modeled temperature change. It actually corresponds, if you recall a few slides back, we were looking at different scenarios, and this actually corresponds to the most severe temperature increase scenario. And it's created using an ensemble of different climate models, but it shows the temperature increases by geographic location, which can then be mapped onto risk exposures that we've identified in earlier stages. Other key inputs to this step are to have the historical engagement and risk assessment details as part of the overall analysis, and then using the historical information and the new analysis that we've done on the climate risk side, combine these to develop risk likelihood evaluations across time. And once we have these initial risk ratings, it's important to then circle back and, as Tal mentioned, communicate this to key stakeholders to agree on the outcomes or to incorporate other opinions or views that may or may not have been factored in. So it might sound like I'm suggesting lots and lots of meetings. That's not the intention. The intention is to make sure that across the business and as a whole business, that there is agreement on the risk exposures and the focus areas as part of building this framework. So at the end of this stage, it might seem like, all right, most of our work is done. But there's a big kind of gaping hole of, so what? We have all this analysis. Is it something that's just nice to know and nice to disclose? The answer to that is no. So actually, the fourth stage here to managing risk uses the information from the previous stages and helps inform decisions around adaptation. So the fourth stage is quite similar in terms of structure to the previous stages. The main aim is to provide insight to the business on the impact and outcomes of adaptation. So again, you'd start off with targeted engagement workshops to identify firstly the capacity or the potential for the business to agree or disagree or proceed with adaptation initiatives or activities. And this will ultimately identify the scope of your actions. And then so the second and third steps are fairly similar. Conduct further research to fill where the gaps are. So identify where the data gaps are, where the analysis gaps are. And from that, refining and creating residual risk ratings. So before we had risk ratings for each risk statement, these are residual risk ratings after factoring in adaptation and potential actions of what the business could take on. And finally, it comes back to the step of communicating this to confirm risk ratings and to guide management decisions. So naturally, any key strategic decision, as well as scientific development or new scenarios, will need to be fed back through these reviews as well. So we expect this to be an iterative process and a framework that I guess is more long-term rather than a point-in-time analysis and you set and forget, if that makes sense. So in these stages, I know it was very quickly covered, but we've spoken about the key considerations from a business perspective. So I'll hand over to Ray now to talk through the climate risk modelling aspect and other considerations.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So building on from Michelle's stages of risk identification, we then move on to the modelling aspects. And essentially we're starting with the outputs from that process of managing the climate risk and building heat maps. We need inputs such as the likelihood, severity, what sectors are affected, how it maps geographically to the particular business that you're looking at. And again, this is very specific and critical to understand the risks and how they relate to your business. So, for example, mortality, morbidity for life and PHI, property risks for GI, credit risks from property losses for banks, and as well as that, to make sure that these are prioritized. So you're prioritizing them not only to allow for the magnitude of the likely impact, but also to make sure that your model is allowing for that in the correct order. In terms of the quantitative approach, we want to allow for both the physical risk, so that's what actually happens in each scenario, but also the transition risk, and that's what happens between now and the sort of the ultimate effect of the climate change scenario. And when we talk transition risk, we're talking things we might do to try to mitigate the ultimate effect of climate change, recognizing that may have a mitigating impact, but also has a cost to the business, whether that's a sort of implementation type cost or some sort of limiting factor on business or claims experience, those types of things. Ultimately, what we're coming up with is a series of climate scenarios, so pathways to climate outcomes. Again, this is not an exact science. We really are trying to look into the future to predict and understand what might happen. And it's very important that the modelling we do reflects that uncertainty and we communicate that appropriately. So if we move on to the next slide, we've got an example that we've sort of put together looking at physical risk for property. So the example itself allows for different scenarios and importantly, long-term projections. Again, this isn't something that's, happening tomorrow. Well, certain things are happening as we speak, but we also need to understand the longer term impact as climate change impacts develop and progress over time. So the model obviously covers different assumptions, the simulations, exposures, and we produce financial outputs, but also business impacts. So we really want to understand what's happening in terms of the business as a whole. And again, the output should be extended to thinking about and considering strategic type impacts. So as an example of that, in New Zealand, the government there is consulting on reforms to mitigate some of these risks. And one of the actions they're considering taking is restricting building in hazardous places. And obviously that comes at a sort of a benefit for the future, but a cost to anybody who's currently in those locations. We've got another example on transition risk, which we'll pretty much skip, but I guess two important things is the materiality of the exposures and also the potential to need to perform a physical risk analysis. So certainly for some of the different types of things that are on the slide, it's not just actuarial expertise that's required, but we need input from other experts. The next slide is the reporting itself. So arguably this is the most important part of anything we do with climate risk, is communicating that to stakeholders, both within the business and outside of the business. Ideally, we want to automate the reporting that we have so that it's easy to understand, it's transparent, it's easy to update. So in terms of the example we've got on this page, we've basically got a dashboard that illustrates the impact on different areas, different sectors, gives different scenarios, and the users can actually drill down into the dashboard and sort of understand different areas that they might be interested in. So in terms of the reporting process, I guess the fundamental is to make sure that we're updating and linking our visualization tools to the final risk ratings, to the models. We're putting recommendations together, summarizing the risks, highlighting different scenarios, making sure that we're aligning messages to internal stakeholders, but also to the disclosures that we might be making under APRA's guidance and also under the international reporting standards, TCFD. In terms of reporting, we've got, again, a bit of an example on how you might look at the hydrogen value chain model. So I'm not claiming to be an expert in this area, but we did think it's quite a topical and interesting example. Over here in WA, we've had a hydrogen car in the office for a few months, and it's quite interesting to see the people use it and then drink the water out of this sort of storage tank at the end of the day. But really, the models provide an analysis of supply and demand and costs for different technology pathways. So that's sort of how you go about developing the technology to use hydrogen, but also then infrastructure, because obviously there's not too many petrol stations that currently supply hydrogen. And then obviously we want scenarios to be looking at the impact of different environmental policies, technology development, how you actually roll out infrastructure, and all of those different things. And particularly, I guess, comparing a sort of cost-benefit analysis to alternative fuel sources. On the next slide, we've got a similar example for decarbonisation pathways. Pretty much going to skip this one, given the time. The next slide, we look at active risk management. So as Michelle said, this isn't really a sort of something that we do in isolation. We've really got to embed it into our risk management frameworks, and that's both looking at reporting and risk controls. So you can see we've summarized the TCFD reporting requirements and implications, and you'll see there's a link back to the impact analysis that we would have been calculating, as well as the business implications. And those are all different aspects that need to be managed through this process, and particularly as the business sort of implements different climate risk standards and upgrades the type of reporting that's done. Because again, given it's an emerging area, given the changing understanding that's coming out, there's no sort of prescriptive reporting requirements, and really each business needs to consider what is most important for it as a business itself. So again, jumping the final slide, really we're talking disclosure. And when we're talking disclosure, there's a number of different stakeholders who are all demanding that businesses identify, assess and manage climate risks and opportunities, because for some businesses there may be opportunities to sort of A, help address the issue, but B, build a business around addressing those types of issues. Broadly, most people would be wanting disclosures to be in line with the sort of relevant guidance coming out of TCFD. And again, one of the key things that APRA has said in their CPG 229 is that a lack of certainty in relation.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we just need to close it up right now. So if you want to put the last slide for those who stayed. Very good. So this is the future that we imagine, essentially as parents and as actuaries as well. Thank you.